Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The motel sat at the edge of town, a relic of a time long past. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the fading light of the afternoon, casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. I had driven by it countless times, but today, for some reason, I decided to stop. The gates were rusted, the windows boarded up, and the air smelled of stale decay. Yet, something about the place drew me in, urging me to explore. I pushed through the gate, the rusted hinges creaking in protest as I stepped into the overgrown parking lot. The asphalt had long since cracked, and weeds had taken root in the gaps. The building loomed in front of me, its once bright exterior faded and peeling. I could see the remnants of old, half-broken furniture inside through the dirty windows. It felt as though time had forgotten this place, leaving it to rot in silence. The door to the office was ajar, the glass cracked and dirty. I stepped inside, the scent of mildew and dust hitting me immediately. The room was empty except for a few scattered papers and a desk piled high with old guest logs. The air was thick with the weight of neglect, and it felt as though the building had been abandoned for decades. Still, something about it felt unsettling, like someone or something was still watching from the shadows. I wandered deeper into the motel, moving from room to room. Each one was eerily the same: broken furniture, torn curtains, and abandoned belongings left behind, as though the guests had disappeared in the middle of their stay. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and the floors creaked under my weight. It was clear that no one had cared for this place in years, yet there was a strange sense of preservation, as though the building itself was holding on to its past. I reached the end of the hallway, where I noticed a door that had been left slightly ajar. A faint sound reached my ears, a quiet, steady noise that I couldn't place at first. As I approached, the sound became clearer. It was the unmistakable rush of water. The sound of a shower running. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I was hearing. The building had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and there had been no mention of anyone living here. How could there be water running in a place with no plumbing? I stepped closer to the door, my curiosity getting the best of me. The room was thick with steam, and as I peered inside, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure through the fogged-up glass of the bathroom door. The air inside was warm, almost suffocating, and the steam swirled in strange, unnatural patterns. I could hear the water running, but the bathroom, I knew, hadn't seen any use in years. The pipes had been disconnected long ago when the motel had closed down. I was certain of that. I pushed the door open, my heart racing in my chest. The steam billowed out into the room, clinging to my skin as I stepped inside. The bathroom was just as I had imagined it: old tiles, a cracked mirror, and a rusty shower head hanging limply from the wall. But there was no water source, no running water. Yet, the sound of the shower running was deafening. It echoed in my ears, and I could almost feel the mist on my face, even though there was no visible source. I looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. The room was frozen in time, as though the last person who stayed here had just stepped out of the shower and left without a trace. The steam swirled in the small space, filling the room with an almost tangible presence. There was no one in sight. The shower head was dry, the pipes disconnected, and yet the sound persisted, a constant hiss of water that filled the room. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around me seemed to thicken, the steam pressing in on all sides. I turned to leave, but before I could reach the door, the sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood frozen for a moment, wondering if I had imagined the entire thing. But no, the steam was still there, thick and lingering in the air, as though something had just been in the room. I stepped back into the hallway, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The motel had been abandoned for years, the water shut off long ago. There was no logical explanation for what I had just experienced. As I walked back down the hall, I felt the distinct sensation of being followed, as though something or someone was trailing behind me, unseen but present. The building creaked as if it were alive, groaning under its own weight. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The quiet hum of the world outside felt distant, muffled by the oppressive atmosphere of the motel. I quickened my pace, eager to escape, but every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. As I reached the front door, the steam from the shower room seemed to follow me. I could feel the temperature rise as I stepped outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warmth I had just left behind. I looked back at the building, its windows dark and lifeless, but I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. There was something in that motel, something that shouldn't have been there. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't shake the image of the steam, the sound of the water, and the eerie silence that followed. My mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. I had to get out of there, far away from that place, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the feeling that the motel was still watching, waiting. Story 2. The fire station had been abandoned for years, its red walls fading and cracked from years of neglect. The doors were rusted shut and the windows were boarded up, but I had always been drawn to places like this. I had spent countless weekends exploring forgotten buildings, searching for relics of the past, and this fire station was no different. There were whispers in town about strange happenings, but I always dismissed them as just that, whispers. The moment I stepped inside, the musty air hit me, and the smell of burnt wood still lingered in the rafters. It was eerie how untouched everything seemed, like time had frozen when the last truck drove out and never returned. The fire trucks were gone, replaced by a thick layer of dust. The floor was littered with old yellowed papers and broken equipment, the walls adorned with faded murals of fires being fought and lives saved. But there was something unsettling about the silence. It wasn't the silence of an abandoned building. It was the silence of a place that once had purpose, now hollowed out. I made my way through the station, running my hand along the edges of a rusted fire axe that hung on the wall. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a forgotten world. The locker rooms were just as I imagined, rows of lockers filled with empty hangars and old uniforms that had long lost their color. Everything seemed to tell a story of the past, of the brave men and women who had walked these halls, never knowing that one day they would be replaced by dust and decay. As I walked down the narrow hallway, I noticed one locker at the end of the room was slightly open. Something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the way the metal door was slightly ajar, or maybe it was the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. My heart raced as I approached the locker, and for a moment, I hesitated. There was no reason to believe anything unusual would happen, but the building had a strange energy. It felt like it was holding on to something that didn't want to be disturbed. I slowly pulled open the door, and inside I found firefighter gear still hanging, as if someone had just left in a hurry. The helmet was covered in dust, the jacket thick and worn, and the boots were scuffed and scratched. It was hard to believe that someone had actually used them not so long ago. I reached for one of the boots and felt a strange sense of unease wash over me. Something was off about this locker, something beyond the usual abandonment I had seen in other places. As I dug my hand into the boot, my fingers brushed against something paper-like. I pulled it out carefully, unfolding it to reveal a note, yellowed with age and worn at the edges. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, as if written in a panic. The words were simple but chilling. He's still here. Don't trust the siren. I stood there for a moment, staring at the note in disbelief. The words seemed to echo in my mind, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Who had written this? And who was he? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. A siren? What was that supposed to mean? And why would someone leave a note in such a secretive, desperate way? The more I thought about it, the more questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers. I shoved the note into my pocket, not sure if I should leave or continue exploring. My curiosity was piqued, and despite the ominous warning, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The fire station had always been a place of life-saving, of heroism, but now it felt like something else, something darker. The air was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were watching me. As I turned away from the locker, the faint sound of a siren broke through the stillness of the building. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it grew louder, unmistakable. The sound of a distant siren echoing through the empty hallways. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The siren seemed to come from nowhere, its mournful wail cutting through the silence. It sounded close, too close for comfort, but there was no way it could be coming from outside. The building was abandoned, the trucks were gone, and the siren should have been silent. I hurried toward the exit, but as I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved, swift and silent, just beyond my vision. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. It was just a flicker, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. My mind raced, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of the fire station before whatever was in there found me. But the siren grew louder, now sounding as though it was right above me. My pulse quickened as I started to run, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The sound of the siren was deafening now, its eerie, shrill wail filling the space. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing as I darted toward the exit. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I turned and ran down another hallway, trying to find another exit, but everywhere I went, the siren followed. It was like the building itself was alive, pulling me deeper inside. I had to get out. I had to escape. But as I turned another corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure standing in the dim light, watching me. I could make out little more than the silhouette of a person, their face obscured by shadows. But I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart stopped and I took a step back. The siren blared louder, its sound now reverberating in my head. I was trapped. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, my body shaking. I turned to run, but as I did, the siren cut off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The figure was gone, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I sprinted for the door, and this time it opened easily. I rushed outside into the cold air, the sound of the siren now a distant memory. Story 3. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something captivating about the stories they held, hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. So when I heard about the old farmhouse at the edge of town, I couldn't resist the urge to explore. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its wood rotting and windows shattered, but it was a perfect spot for a solo adventure. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I arrived, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The farmhouse stood against the fading light, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. I approached carefully, stepping over broken fencing and thick vines that had overtaken the front porch. The air smelled musty, a mixture of old wood and the damp earth that seemed to seep from every corner of the building. I pushed the door open with some effort, the hinges squealing in protest, and stepped inside. The interior of the house was as I expected: faded wallpaper, empty rooms, and the unmistakable scent of mildew. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by my footsteps. I wandered through the lower levels first, finding little more than rotting furniture and the remnants of a life long forgotten. But my curiosity led me upstairs, to the attic. The staircase was narrow and creaked under my weight, and as I ascended, I felt a cold draft brush past me, as though the house itself was exhaling after years of silence. When I reached the attic, I had to squint through the gloom. The space was small and cramped, the rafters low and covered in webs. A few old boxes were stacked against the walls, and piles of tattered clothing lay scattered around. But it was what I found on the far wall that made my heart skip a beat. At first, I thought it was just another strange mark on the wall, a stain or a faded pattern. But as I stepped closer, I realized it was something much more unsettling. The entire wall was covered in tally marks, hundreds of them, stretching from floor to ceiling. They were drawn hastily, almost frantically, as though the person who had marked them had been in a hurry. Some were neat and straight, others jagged and uneven, as though the hand that made them had been trembling. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I was looking at. The marks seemed to cover every inch of the wall, a relentless counting that went on and on. But what struck me most was the sense of urgency in the marks, as though whoever had made them had been counting down to something or keeping track of something that couldn't be ignored. Next to the wall, there was a small mattress on the floor. It looked out of place in the otherwise dilapidated room. The sheets were clean, almost unnaturally so, and the mattress appeared to be in better condition than anything else in the house. There was no dust on it, no sign of wear. It was as if it had been placed there recently, despite the years of neglect around it. A small child's toy sat on the mattress, a worn-out stuffed bear with a missing eye. It looked like it had been there for years, yet somehow it also appeared brand new, as if it had been carefully placed there only moments before. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The tally marks, the mattress, the toy, it didn't make sense. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as the air in the attic seemed to grow colder. A sense of unease settled over me, and I found myself stepping back, unsure of whether I wanted to explore further or leave immediately. But my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot, my eyes scanning the room for any hint of an explanation. I walked over to the mattress, kneeling down to examine the stuffed bear. The toy was oddly warm, almost as if it had been recently held by someone. The fur was soft, too soft for something that should have been left abandoned for so long. I ran my fingers over it, and a strange feeling washed over me, as though the toy was waiting for something or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone in the room. The tally marks on the wall seemed to pull me back. I counted them in my head: 100, 200, 300. There were so many, too many for me to track individually, but I couldn't stop myself from trying. I began to feel as though the marks were watching me, as though they held some sort of secret I was meant to uncover. But the more I looked, the more confused I became. There was no pattern, no logic to the markings. It felt like something or someone had been counting, but for what purpose? I reached up to touch the wall, running my hand over the rough surface of the tally marks. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled my hand away, startled, and turned to see a small metal box tucked in the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. It was rusted and battered, but it didn't look as old as everything else in the attic. I hesitated for a moment before walking over to it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I bent down to open it, a faint sound echoed through the house, a creak, a thud, something shifting behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I slowly turned around, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was no one. Just the silence of the old house, thick and suffocating. I reached for the box again, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. Inside, there was nothing but a single sheet of paper, crumpled and stained with age. I unfolded it carefully, feeling a cold chill run down my spine as I read the words scrawled across it. For day 97. He's here. I can hear him moving in the walls. The tally marks are getting closer. I need to keep counting. I need to keep track. The words stopped there, abruptly. No more entries, no explanation, nothing to give me any clue as to who had written it or why. I closed the box and shoved it back into the corner. The room felt darker now, heavier, as though the walls were closing in. I couldn't stay here any longer. I backed away from the wall of tally marks, from the mattress, from the toy. The house seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. I left the attic quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, and didn't look back. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that attic was still there, watching, waiting. And I wondered who or what had been counting. Story 4. The old bowling alley sat on the outskirts of town, its once vibrant neon signs now flickering faintly in the distance, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I had heard rumors about it for years, how it had been abandoned for decades, left to rot and gather dust. The windows were boarded up, and the doors had been chained shut, but curiosity always had a way of pushing me toward places like this. One afternoon, when the air was thick with a hazy fog, I decided to find out for myself. I parked my car in the empty lot, the silence of the place weighing heavily on me. As I approached the side entrance, I noticed the chain that hung loosely around the door handle. It wasn't locked. I pushed the door open, the sound of creaking hinges echoing through the abandoned building. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and old wood. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The main room stretched out before me, the once bustling lanes now covered in a thick layer of grime. Broken light fixtures hung from the ceiling, their dull glow struggling to illuminate the emptiness. I walked down the aisles, my footsteps muffled by the decades of dust that had settled on the floor. The bowling balls, once a vibrant collection of colors, now lay scattered across the tables, their surfaces cracked and faded. The place felt frozen in time, as though no one had stepped inside in years. But then, as I walked past the lanes, I stopped dead in my tracks. One of the lanes was different. It was as if someone had just finished setting up for a game. The pins were perfectly aligned, standing tall and pristine, untouched by time. The lane gleamed under the dim light, a stark contrast to the rest of the dilapidated room. And at the front of the lane, sitting patiently, was a bowling ball, smooth, shiny, and freshly placed, as if waiting for the next player to roll it. I took a hesitant step closer, my heart rate quickening. The ball looked so out of place in the stillness of the room. It was a solid shade of deep purple, its glossy surface reflecting the dull light around it. It didn't look like any of the old, cracked bowling balls scattered across the tables. This one seemed almost new, but there was no way. The place had been abandoned for years, and no one had set foot here in as long as I could remember. So why was it so perfectly set up, as though someone was still in the middle of a game? I reached out to touch the ball, my fingers brushing against its cool surface. A shiver ran down my spine as I wondered how it had ended up here, in the middle of an abandoned alley. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the lanes, but there was only silence. Not even the usual creaks and groans of an old building. Just stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed thicker around me now, heavier. My pulse quickened as I took another step forward, drawn to the lane. There was a strange pull, as though the game was somehow still in progress, waiting for me to play. The more I stood there, the more it felt like I was intruding on something that had been left behind, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I looked back at the lane, wondering if it had always been this pristine. Had the pins always been perfectly lined up like this? I couldn't remember. Everything else in the building was falling apart, decaying under years of neglect. But here, this one lane seemed untouched, almost cared for. It was as though someone had been here recently, just moments ago. But who? Way. I turned my attention back to the ball. It was so perfectly placed, resting at the front of the lane, just waiting for someone to bowl. I reached down and picked it up, the weight of it surprising me. It felt solid, real, almost too real for something that had been left in an abandoned building. As I held it, I felt the faintest tremor in my hand. The room around me seemed to shift, the air growing colder, heavier, as if the building itself was reacting to the presence of the ball. Without thinking, I rolled it down the lane, watching as it glided smoothly over the polished wood. The ball seemed to move with purpose, as if it had a mind of its own. I stood there, watching it travel, feeling the strange tension in the air. It hit the pins with a satisfying clatter, knocking them down with perfect precision. The sound of the pins crashing to the ground was deafening in the quiet room, but it was the silence that followed that unsettled me. I stared at the pins, now scattered across the lane, as if the game had just concluded. But there was no one there to celebrate the strike. No cheering or laughter, just the sound of my own breath, heavy in the stillness. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Had I really just bowled a strike in an abandoned building? Or had I imagined it? I looked around the room once more, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There were no signs of anyone else being there, no footprints in the dust, no sounds of movement from another room. Yet something about the scene felt wrong, as though I wasn't alone. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the lane, and that's when I noticed that the ball had returned to the front of the lane. It was back in its original position, waiting for the next roll. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. The ball hadn't rolled back on its own. I was sure of it, but somehow it had returned to its starting position, just as if the game had continued without me. I could feel my breath quicken, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. The room, the lane, the ball, it was all too perfect, too staged. I didn't want to find out who or what had set up the game, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. As I backed away from the lane, I heard the faintest sound, the soft rolling of the ball on the wood. I turned to leave, but as I did, the ball rolled down the lane once more, hitting the pins with a quiet crash. And just like that, I knew whatever had been left behind here was far from gone. It was still waiting. Story 5. The abandoned elementary school loomed in the distance, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. I had been fascinated by the place ever since I first saw it from the road. It seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere, like a forgotten relic of a different time. The building was decaying, but there was something about it that called to me, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. I slipped through a gap in the wooden boards and entered through a back door that creaked under my weight. The air inside was musty, heavy with the scent of stale books and mildew. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor was covered with layers of dust and debris. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. It was as though the school had been abandoned midlife, like someone had simply walked away and never returned. As I moved further inside, I noticed the hallways were lined with old classroom doors. Some of them were open, revealing dusty desks and forgotten chairs. Others were locked, their windows cracked or completely shattered. I couldn't help but wonder why this place had been left behind. There were no signs of vandalism, no broken windows or smashed lockers. It was as though time had simply frozen, leaving everything intact but completely still. I came across the teacher's lounge near the back of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from inside. Curiosity urged me to step closer, so I pushed the door open gently. The room was small, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It smelled like old coffee and stale air, but there was something oddly familiar about it, as though I had walked into a place that once held warmth and life. A small round table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Several coffee cups rested on the table, some half filled with dark liquid, others stained with dried remnants of old coffee. What struck me most were the lipstick marks on the rim of one of the cups, a faint red smear that seemed fresh. I leaned in closer, examining it carefully. There was no mistaking it, the stain was recent, not years old like the rest of the decay around me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Who had been here? Who had left this mark? The thought of someone else, someone living, having been in this place, left me with an uneasy feeling. I moved toward the corner of the room, where a small radio sat on a shelf. The soft hum of static filled the room, and for a moment I thought it was broken. But then the static shifted, and the sound of a faint voice came through. It was a local radio station, one that I recognized immediately, even though it had been shut down for years. The familiar voice of the late-night DJ filled the air, announcing weather reports and upcoming events, just like it had when the station was still active. I froze in place. How could this be? The station had gone off the air a long time ago, yet here it was, still broadcasting, still playing the same jingles and music that had long since disappeared from the airwaves. I glanced around the room, my mind racing. The coffee cups, the lipstick stain, the radio, it all felt wrong. Like I had stepped into a moment frozen in time, a moment that shouldn't exist. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time since entering the school, I felt like I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something was watching me. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the radio, half expecting it to cut out or for the voice to suddenly change. But it didn't. It kept playing, the same old songs and familiar announcements, like nothing had ever changed. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the room became unbearable. I turned away from the radio and looked around again. The table, the chairs, the half-eaten food left behind, it all seemed so real, so lived in. Yet there was no one here. No one but me. I moved to the window, trying to peer outside, but the glass was so dirty that I could barely make out anything beyond the building's cracked facade. The world outside felt distant, as though I had stepped into another time entirely, a place where the boundaries between past and present blurred together. I couldn't stay any longer. The eerie feeling had become too overwhelming, too suffocating. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I stopped. The radio was still playing, but the voice of the DJ had changed. It wasn't the late-night host anymore. It was a woman's voice, one that sounded strangely familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that it was the voice of someone I knew. A former teacher, one who had worked at this very school before it closed. Her voice was clear and warm, recounting memories of the students she had taught, the lessons she had shared. But then her tone shifted, becoming softer, almost wistful, as she spoke of the day the school had been shut down. I couldn't move. The voice seemed to echo through the room, resonating in my chest as though it was meant for me. I felt my pulse quicken, the air growing thicker as I stood there frozen. The radio crackled, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The static returned, and the music resumed as though nothing had happened. But it had. I was certain of it. I had heard her, and I could feel her presence in the room, as though she was still here, still waiting. I didn't dare linger any longer. I pushed the door open and rushed back into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps loud in the otherwise silent building. I didn't look back as I made my way to the exit. The coffee cups, the lipstick stains, the radio, they stayed with me, haunting me as I left the school behind. I didn't tell anyone what I had experienced, but I couldn't forget it. The teacher's lounge, the voice on the radio, it felt like a secret that was never meant to be uncovered, a moment frozen in time that refused to stay buried. Story 6. The old fairground had been abandoned for years, its once vibrant colors faded and replaced with the dull grays of neglect. The gates, rusted and half-fallen, creaked in the wind, but there was something about the place that drew me in. I had heard rumors about the fairground's mysterious past, how it had been shut down overnight after a series of accidents. But curiosity, as it often does, overpowered any sense of caution, and I found myself standing at the edge of the lot, staring at the overgrown pathways and the skeletons of old rides. I climbed over the broken fence, the metal scraping against my jeans. The air smelled of old wood, mildew, and the faintest trace of something metallic, almost like blood. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its towering frame now a tangle of twisted steel, the seat swaying gently in the breeze as if still waiting for passengers. I walked slowly toward it, my footsteps crunching over the scattered gravel. The fairground was eerily quiet, no birds, no sounds of life, just the whistling wind. As I wandered deeper into the heart of the fairground, my flashlight beam danced across long forgotten booths, their colors swallowed by the dark. The games were abandoned, the prizes long since taken or rotted away. There were signs too, their edges curling and peeling, advertising attractions that no longer existed. I couldn't help but feel a strange unease creeping over me, as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was then that I saw the security camera. Nestled on top of a wooden post, half hidden by vines and overgrowth, a small red light blinked steadily. My first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity. Why would a place like this still have a working camera? Who would be watching? But as I moved closer, I realized that the camera was pointed directly at the Ferris wheel. My heart skipped a beat as I wondered if someone was still using it to monitor the grounds. I stepped forward to get a better look, my curiosity now fully piqued. The camera seemed oddly well maintained considering the state of everything around it. It was old, yes, but it looked clean, with the red light blinking steadily in the darkness. I could see the faint outline of the Ferris wheel in the distance, and I felt an overwhelming urge to watch it, to see if anything was moving. That was when I noticed that something wasn't right. The Ferris wheel was turning. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a trick of the light, maybe. The wind was blowing, after all, and it wasn't out of the question that the old structure might creak or sway. But no, it wasn't the wind. The Ferris wheel was turning slowly, steadily, its creaky metal frame groaning in the silence. I could see the seats shifting, moving higher, then lowering, as if someone were riding in them. But there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat, my legs frozen to the spot. I turned back to the camera, its red light now feeling unnervingly like a warning. I could have sworn that the light had flickered for a moment, as if someone had just noticed me standing there. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to move toward the Ferris wheel, hoping it was just a mechanical glitch or some bizarre, explainable occurrence. But as I approached, the wheel didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It kept moving, as though it had a life of its own. The closer I got, the more I could feel a presence in the air, like something was watching me. No, something was waiting. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch the rusty metal of one of the seats. It was cold to the touch, colder than I expected for an object left in the open for years. The faintest sound of laughter echoed through the air, distant and hollow, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I jerked my hand back, looking around wildly. I was alone. The only sounds were the creaking of the Ferris wheel and my own shallow breathing. I stepped back, but as I did, I noticed something even stranger. The camera, it was still blinking, but now it felt like it was moving, following my every step. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Was I imagining things? Had I triggered something? Was the camera tracking my movements? Without thinking, I turned and ran, not caring if the camera was still following me. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced through the fairground, the distant sound of the Ferris wheels creaking growing louder in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had been waiting for me to make a move. The eerie laughter seemed to grow, swelling until it was all I could hear. I stumbled past the old food stands, the rusted metal gates, the decaying remnants of carnival games. Every corner I turned felt like I was being herded, pushed toward the Ferris wheel, where I knew the camera was still watching. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence, that constant, blinking red light just behind me, like an eye that never blinked. By the time I reached the entrance again, I was out of breath, panic clawing at my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back at the broken fence, climbing over it once more, my hands slick with sweat. As I stumbled into the woods beyond the fairground, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. The Ferris wheel was still turning. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I avoided looking at any security cameras, avoided places that felt too familiar. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red light, blinking steadily, watching. I don't know what I disturbed in that place, but I knew one thing for sure: the fairground wasn't as abandoned as I thought. And the camera was still watching. Story 7. The house stood like a hollowed-out skeleton, blackened by fire but still stubbornly standing amid the overgrown brush. I'd passed it a few times before, wondering what had happened to it. The roof had caved in, and the walls were charred, the remains of a long-forgotten fire still leaving a stench in the air. The local kids had always said it was haunted, that something bad had happened there, but I didn't believe in such things. On a whim, I decided to take a closer look. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting like an old man in pain. The front door hung slightly ajar, its frame blackened by the fire, but still offering a way inside. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should venture in, but my curiosity got the best of me. I stepped through the door into the dark, acrid air of the house. The first thing I noticed was the smell: smoke, dampness, and something faintly metallic that stung my nose. The walls were covered in soot, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and debris. It was eerie, as if the fire had taken everything, yet left something behind. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the heavy darkness. The beams that once supported the house had cracked and bowed, making the air feel heavy, as though the structure might collapse at any moment. I wandered deeper into the wreckage, hoping to find something interesting, maybe a clue as to what had happened to the place. But the further I went, the more oppressive the silence became. No animals, no wind. Just the distant creak of wood settling, as though the house was still alive, waiting. That's when I saw a mirror leaning against the wall, its edges singed and cracked, but somehow still intact. It was out of place in the midst of the ruin, almost as if it had been placed there intentionally. I walked closer, my heart beating a little faster as I approached the glass. The surface was dirty and clouded with years of dust, but something was off about it. As I wiped away the grime, I noticed the faintest trace of something written on the glass. I leaned in, squinting, and that's when the words became clear. "I watched you find this." The chill that ran down my spine was immediate, like ice water being poured over me. I stepped back quickly, my mind racing. How could someone have written that? I had been alone. I had entered the house alone, and there had been no signs of anyone else here. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I glanced around, the silence pressing in on me. The words seemed to be mocking me, as though they had been waiting for me to arrive. I ran my fingers along the edges of the mirror, feeling the cool surface. The glass was unnaturally smooth, and yet I could feel an odd residue clinging to it, as though it had been touched recently. I shivered, knowing that I couldn't explain it. I stepped away from the mirror, unsure of what to do next. The house felt even more oppressive now, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But the room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a prank, a sick joke someone had left behind. But as I turned to leave, I heard something, a faint creak, like the sound of footsteps on the floor above. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The silence followed, broken only by the sound of my breathing. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping cautiously back toward the door. The house seemed to close in around me, the darkness thickening with each step I took. But then, Just as I reached the threshold, I heard it again, this time louder, more distinct. Or footsteps. And they were coming from above. I turned, my heart racing. The thought of someone else being here, someone who had left that message for me, sent a surge of panic through my chest. I wanted to leave, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, as if the house itself was keeping me in place. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. And then from above I heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Look, you shouldn't have come here." It was the kind of voice that made your blood run cold, the kind of voice that made you question everything. My mind went blank, and I spun around, ready to flee. But when I looked up, there was no one there. I didn't waste any more time. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The broken floorboards creaked beneath me as I ran, and I didn't look back until I was outside, standing in the overgrown yard. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized my hands were shaking. I had to get out of there, away from the house, away from whatever was lingering in those burned walls. As I drove away, my mind replayed the events over and over. I could still see the message on the mirror, still hear the voice in my head. The further I got from the house, the less I felt like I had escaped. The house had left something behind, something that had followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the house still had a hold on me, even though I was miles away. Story 8. The abandoned hotel had always intrigued me. It stood at the edge of town, a forgotten monument to a time long past. I had heard rumors about it: the grand ballroom, the fading elegance, the whispers of strange happenings within its walls. I decided to explore it one afternoon, my curiosity overwhelming my hesitation. The exterior was as run down as the rumors suggested, with cracked windows and peeling paint, but there was a certain allure to it, like an old mystery begging to be unraveled. I pushed through the broken doors, the hinges creaking as they gave way. The lobby was empty, save for the remnants of old furniture, tattered couches, overturned chairs, and dust-covered mirrors. The air smelled stale, with the faintest hint of mildew and decay. The hotel had been deserted for years, but it still held an air of grandeur, like it was waiting for something or someone to bring it back to life. I wandered through the halls, each one more decrepit than the last. The wallpaper was faded and torn, and the once glittering chandeliers had long since gone dark. As I moved deeper into the hotel, I felt a strange sensation creeping up my spine. It was as though I wasn't truly alone here, though I could see no one else. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached the ballroom, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The doors creaked open, revealing a vast room bathed in an eerie, dim light. The grand chandelier overhead was still lit, its crystals gleaming faintly despite the apparent neglect. The light flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. But what struck me most was the sound. Faint classical music played softly in the background, as if a phonograph had been left running, though I couldn't see any source for the melody. The music was haunting, its melody slow and mournful, like a forgotten waltz suspended in time. It filled the room, making the air feel thicker, almost charged with an invisible energy. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unable to move, my eyes scanning the ballroom for any signs of life. But there was nothing, only the strange contrast of the opulence and decay. As I stepped further into the room, I noticed the table. It was set for dinner, placed in the center of the ballroom as though someone had just finished preparing for a grand meal. The tablecloth was crisp and white, untouched by the dust that clung to everything else in the hotel. 2 chairs sat on either side of the table, positioned neatly, as if waiting for guests to arrive. The strange part, however, was the dinner itself. A steak dinner sat on the table, the food long rotted away into a disgusting, foul-smelling mess. The meat was blackened and shriveled, the once juicy steak now a grotesque, unidentifiable mass. The sides, some sort of mashed potatoes and wilted vegetables, had disintegrated into a sickening heap of rot. The scent of decay was overpowering, mixing with the stale air of the ballroom. But despite the ruined food, the table still seemed to beckon me, as if it had been waiting for someone to join the dinner that would never come. I took a step closer, my curiosity pulling me forward despite the nauseating stench. The music played on, its notes soft and melancholic, the rhythm never changing. It felt surreal, like I had stepped into a moment frozen in time. My gaze lingered on the table, the 2 chairs, the decaying dinner. It was as though everything had been left in haste, yet carefully arranged, an invitation to something I couldn't understand. I reached out to touch the edge of the table, my fingers brushing against the worn surface. It was smooth, but cold, and the dust on the cloth shifted at my touch. As I stood there, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease wash over me. The longer I stayed in the room, the heavier the air became. The music, once faint and distant, now seemed to pulse around me, filling every corner of the room. It was as though the hotel was alive in its own strange way, holding on to something it couldn't let go of. A strange chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart began to beat faster, the once welcome silence now oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I turned, scanning the ballroom once more, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But the room remained empty, save for the eerie dinner table and the flickering chandelier. I turned back toward the table, my eyes drawn once more to the decayed steak. I couldn't understand why it was there, why everything had been set so carefully, only for the meal to rot away in the silence. My gaze lingered on the empty chairs, imagining the people who might have once sat there eating their meal, waiting for something or someone to arrive. But the chairs were empty now, as empty as the hotel itself, and I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness, as though I was intruding on something that had been abandoned long ago. The music stopped abruptly, cutting through the stillness like a knife. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The silence that followed was deafening. The chandelier above me dimmed, the light flickering once more before going dark completely. The ballroom was plunged into darkness, and I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the tension in the air so thick I could almost taste it. The silence was absolute. And then faintly I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, like a chair being pulled across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowly turned toward the sound, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. For a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized that I was no longer alone in the ballroom. A cold, unseen presence seemed to hang in the air, pressing in from all sides. The music had stopped, but I could still feel its lingering presence, echoing in the pit of my stomach. My breath quickened, and I stepped backward, my mind urging me to leave to run, but my feet felt frozen to the spot. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the lights flickered back on, bright and harsh, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, the ballroom was just as empty as it had been when I first arrived. The table was still set, the rotten dinner still sitting untouched. But the sensation of being watched remained, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and bolted for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air filling my lungs as I gasped for breath. The hotel loomed behind me, dark and silent, as though it had never been disturbed. The music, the dinner, the chairs, they were all gone from my mind now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew one thing for sure: I would never step foot inside that hotel again. It was a place frozen in time, waiting for something or someone to return. Story 9. I had always been drawn to abandoned places, the ones most people would avoid, the ones that had stories buried in their rusted pipes and cracked walls. That day, I found myself standing at the entrance to an old, condemned subway tunnel that had been closed off for years. The sign warning of dangers and trespassing was half obscured by overgrown ivy, but I didn't mind. I'd explored plenty of places like this before, but something about this tunnel felt different, like it was waiting for me. The air inside the tunnel was damp, thick with the smell of mold and decay. My flashlight illuminated the graffiti-covered walls and broken tiles underfoot as I ventured deeper into the tunnel. I moved carefully, the sound of my boots echoing off the walls, making the place feel more alive than it should have. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, as though the tunnel itself had swallowed every trace of sound. After about 10 minutes of walking, I found a small alcove off to the side. It looked like it had once been a service area, with a rusted door now hanging off its hinges. I almost didn't notice the backpack at first, sitting in the shadow of the alcove, partially hidden beneath a pile of crumpled newspapers and plastic wrappers. Curious, I knelt down to inspect it. It was a simple black backpack, worn from time and neglect, but it looked out of place in the otherwise empty tunnel. When I opened the zipper, my heart skipped a beat. Inside there was a phone, still charged and flashing with a new notification. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of urgency as I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The screen came to life, and I saw a video file marked with today's date. The timestamp showed it was recorded just minutes earlier. My first thought was that it was a prank, but as I hit play, my stomach sank. The video showed the tunnel entrance, the one I had just passed through moments before. It was static at first, showing nothing more than the empty darkness. But then, as if the camera had been recording in real time, it panned to the left, following the outline of the tunnel toward where I stood now. I was walking, the light of my flashlight bobbing in the frame. It was unmistakably me. My footsteps echoed faintly in the video, just as they were echoing in real life. I froze. The feeling of unease that had been creeping up on me turned into something much colder. There was no way someone else could have filmed this. I had been alone. I glanced around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the tunnel was empty. The phone continued to play, and the video moved forward, following my every step. I could see myself walking further into the tunnel, unaware of the camera, unaware that someone had been watching me the entire time. Panic started to rise in my chest as the video suddenly jumped to a new scene. The angle shifted, showing me walking deeper into the tunnel. The view was different, as if the person filming had moved closer, following me. In the video, I could see my own figure in the distance, but the eerie part was the way the camera lingered on me, zooming in on my back, the movement slow and deliberate, like the person filming was waiting for something, waiting for me to turn around. I turned around then, my heart hammering in my throat. The tunnel stretched behind me, as dark and empty as it had been before. There was no one there, no sign of another person, no sign of movement. Yet the video continued to play, showing my past self walking deeper into the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I had walked into something I couldn't fully understand. I shoved the phone back into the backpack and stood up, my legs suddenly feeling weak. The weight of the silence in the tunnel pressed down on me. I looked over my shoulder again, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, but there was nothing. I took a few tentative steps back, keeping my flashlight trained on the shadows. The farther I moved, the more I felt a creeping sensation at the base of my spine, as if something was following me, something I couldn't see but could feel. I glanced down at the backpack in my hand, the phone still vibrating slightly from the notifications that kept coming in. I could almost hear the hum of the device, as if it were urging me to keep looking. I didn't want to go back to the tunnel entrance, but the thought of staying there any longer felt even worse. With every step I took toward the exit, I expected to hear footsteps behind me, but the silence remained. I tried not to think about the video, about the fact that someone or something had been following my every move. I forced myself to focus on the light at the end of the tunnel, the faint glow growing as I neared it. When I finally emerged from the tunnel, I felt like I could breathe again. The cold air outside hit me like a shock, clearing the weight that had settled in my chest. I almost dropped the backpack in my panic to get away from the tunnel. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. I left the backpack in the abandoned subway entrance, not daring to take it with me. I didn't want to see the video again, didn't want to know what it meant. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something had been there before me. That the person filming me wasn't a coincidence. I wondered who else had been watching me and why they had left that phone behind. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The tunnel entrance looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. Whatever had been following me, whatever had captured me on that phone, was still out there. And I couldn't help but wonder if I had just left something behind, something I should have never found. Story 10. The abandoned zoo sat at the edge of a dense forest, long forgotten by the world. It had once been a place of excitement, a place where families would come to see the exotic animals that had been brought in from distant lands. Now the gates were rusted and the paths cracked, the air thick with the scent of decay. Nature had slowly reclaimed the land, vines crawling up the fences, trees growing where cages used to be. Yet, I was drawn to it, a curiosity I couldn't ignore. I slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, careful not to make too much noise. The zoo was eerily silent, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It felt as if the world had stopped moving the moment I stepped inside. As I wandered further in, the abandoned enclosures loomed like ghosts of a past that no longer existed. Some had collapsed, their once pristine walls now shattered by time. Others were overgrown with weeds, the structures barely visible beneath the thick green foliage. The path led me to a large, dilapidated building that looked like it had been the zoo's central hub. Through cracked windows, I could see faded posters on the walls and broken-down offices. But what caught my attention more was the zoo's animal enclosures. They stretched out like forgotten cages, most of them empty. Yet one in particular stood out. The metal gate was slightly ajar, and within, a food dish lay on the ground. It was filled with fresh meat, raw, red, and still glistening. There was no sign of an animal. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. It was odd, most of the zoo was untouched, the cages empty, but this one had fresh food. The scent of the meat hung heavily in the air, and I couldn't help but wonder who or what had placed it there. My first thought was that perhaps there was an animal still lurking around. Maybe a caretaker had left the food for something that hadn't been found yet. But the silence around me was unnerving, and the absence of any other footprints only added to the mystery. I stepped closer to the enclosure, cautiously inspecting the food dish. The meat was perfectly cut, not a scrap of it spoiled or touched by time. It was almost too fresh, too perfect for an abandoned zoo. There was no sign of the animal that should have been there, and the ground around the enclosure remained untouched, save for my own footsteps. I leaned over the gate, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. As I took another step forward, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It was as though the air had shifted, the quiet pressing in on me from all sides. A chill crept down my spine, and I glanced around, my heart racing. The zoo felt different now. The overgrown vines and empty cages no longer seemed like a peaceful ruin. Instead, they felt like a trap, a forgotten place that held secrets far darker than I could have imagined. I looked down at my feet, noticing how my own footprints stood out starkly against the untouched ground. The soft dirt was unmarked by anything else. No other footprints, no signs of movement from any animal, or even a person. Just mine. I swallowed hard, the uneasy feeling growing. There had to be an explanation, something logical that I hadn't considered yet. But with every second that passed, the sense of wrongness deepened. I stepped back from the food dish, turning my gaze toward the rest of the zoo. The trees rustled in the distance, but everything felt distant, unreal. My thoughts were racing. How could something as simple as a food dish make me feel this unsettled? Why was it that the absence of life seemed more disturbing than the decay of the place itself? The zoo had been abandoned for years, but someone or something had been here recently. The question that lingered in my mind was who? I made my way to the next enclosure, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The air was thick, and I felt like I was being watched. It was irrational, but every part of me screamed that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows watching me. But there was nothing, only the crumbling structures and the overgrown paths. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, or that I was no longer in a place of forgotten history, but in one that was waiting. The further I wandered, the more surreal the zoo felt. The path I followed seemed to stretch on forever, the same crumbling enclosures, the same silence, and yet I couldn't find my way out. I retraced my steps, hoping to see the entrance again, but the zoo had somehow shifted. The gates I had passed through seemed impossibly distant. The trees loomed higher, casting long shadows over the path. I had no idea how long I had been walking, but it felt like hours. I reached a section of the zoo that looked even more neglected than the others, the buildings crumbling and broken. One of the walls had collapsed entirely, leaving a gap where I could see nothing but dark space. And then, from the darkness within the building, I thought I saw movement. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively took a step back. Something was in there, something that didn't belong in an abandoned zoo. My curiosity almost got the better of me. I wanted to approach, to understand what was in the shadows, but the overwhelming sense of danger held me back. I turned and ran, my footsteps loud in the otherwise silent zoo. I didn't look back until I was at the broken fence, and when I did, I thought I saw something, just a flash of movement in the distance, far beyond the trees. But I couldn't be sure. Story 11. The apartment complex stood at the edge of town, its windows boarded up, the once bright walls faded and peeling under years of neglect. It was the kind of place people avoided, the kind of place that no longer had a reason to exist. I had always wondered about it as I drove past, seeing the broken gates and the abandoned cars in the lot. But today, something felt different. Something called me to stop and explore. The door to the building creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. Dust hung in the air, suspended in the dim light that filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The stench of mildew and rot filled my nostrils, and the silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant creaking of the building's frame. The complex had been abandoned for years, and it was clear that no one had stepped foot inside for a long time. I wandered through the halls, each apartment door sealed with layers of thick, rotting wood. Some doors were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the decaying interiors. As I moved deeper into the building, I noticed something unusual. One of the doors was open wider than the others, just enough for me to slip inside. The apartment inside looked like any other, furniture covered in dust, broken windows, and wallpaper peeling off the walls. But something caught my attention in the far corner of the room. There, sitting on an old, rickety desk, was a laptop. The screen glowed faintly in the otherwise dark room, and the sound of typing echoed through the silence, sharp and rhythmic. My heart skipped a beat. It was an odd thing to find in an abandoned place, especially considering the power had long been cut off in the building. Yet, here it was, a laptop running a Word document, as though someone had been working on it just moments before. I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued. The screen flickered, and the typing paused for a moment before it continued. I leaned over, reading the words on the document, the last sentence sending a chill down my spine. It read, "He's coming down the hall." I froze, my blood running cold. The apartment was silent, save for the sound of my own breathing. There was no one else here. No one had lived in this building for years. I was alone. Yet the words on the screen seemed to suggest otherwise. Someone had typed them, someone who had been here recently, someone who knew something I didn't. I stood there, staring at the laptop, my mind racing. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. I reached for the laptop, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed a key to move the cursor. The screen went dark for a moment before flickering back to life, but the document remained open. The sentence that had been typed remained, as if it had never been disturbed. My eyes scanned the rest of the room, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, watching me. But the apartment was empty, just as I had left it when I first entered. The building groaned under the weight of years of neglect, and the only sound now was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, drawn to the screen, drawn to the words that seemed to echo in my mind. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of what was happening. The screen flickered again, and the typing resumed. The words were slow at first, then faster, more erratic. "He's closer," the document now read. "I can hear him coming. He'll find me soon. I can't hide. I'm trapped." A wave of nausea washed over me as I backed away from the laptop, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, my voice trapped inside. I glanced around the room again, every corner seeming darker, every shadow deeper than before. I felt a presence in the room, an unseen force watching me, waiting. Suddenly, the typing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, in the stillness, I heard something, a faint shuffling sound coming from the hallway outside the apartment. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, as though someone was moving down the hall, just beyond the door. I turned toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The door to the apartment creaked open slowly, a sliver of darkness peeking through. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to obey. I watched as the door inched open, the space between the door and the frame growing wider. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the entire building. I gasped for breath, my eyes wide in shock. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I glanced back at the laptop, the screen now dark. The Word document had vanished, replaced by a blank screen. But there was something else. A message appeared on the screen in bold black letters. "You should have left." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, the adrenaline finally kicking in. I turned and bolted for the door, my feet pounding against the floor as I ran. The building seemed to stretch on forever, the halls endless, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, following me through the darkened halls. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door, the cool night air hitting my face as I burst outside. I looked back once, the building looming in the distance, silent and still. The words on the screen echoed in my mind, "You should have left." And as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized I never should have entered that building in the first place. Story 12. The doors of the abandoned rec center creaked as I pushed them open. The once vibrant building now stood silent, its halls echoing the faint remnants of laughter and activity from years ago. I'd been to plenty of places like this before, decaying schools, forgotten factories, but there was something different about the rec center. Perhaps it was the basketball court, the very heart of the place, where the sounds of bouncing balls and sneakers squeaking had once filled the air. Now it was just me, alone, in the eerie quiet. The gymnasium was large and open, the wooden floor dull and scratched from years of neglect. The basketball hoops loomed over the space, their nets frayed and twisted, hanging like forgotten memories. A few pieces of broken equipment lay scattered around, evidence of the center's sudden abandonment. The building smelled faintly of mildew and old sweat, a scent that felt almost suffocating in the still air. The only light came from the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long, crooked shadows across the floor. I wandered into the middle of the gym, my footsteps echoing loudly as I took in the forgotten relics of a place that once served as the heart of the community. I had no particular goal in mind, just exploring, as I usually did. My flashlight flickered slightly, casting a beam of light that darted across the room, illuminating bits of dust floating in the stagnant air. The silence was oppressive, almost too much to bear. I thought I heard something, a distant creak, a faint shuffle, but when I stopped and listened, the silence returned. That's when I saw it. A basketball, sitting motionless in the center of the floor. It wasn't out of place, not exactly, but something about it stood out. I wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the way it rested perfectly still, or the way it seemed to be waiting for something. I took a few steps closer, my curiosity piqued. My flashlight's beam fell across the ball, casting a soft glow on the faded orange surface. It looked like any other basketball, except for one thing: it was beginning to roll. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Perhaps a draft of air had moved through the room, nudging the ball. But the more I watched, the less likely that seemed. There was no breeze, no wind, and no slope in the floor to cause the ball to move. It rolled slowly, inch by inch, heading directly toward me. My heart began to race, an uneasy sensation creeping up my spine. I took another step back, my eyes fixed on the ball as it continued its slow, deliberate journey. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I'd explored plenty of abandoned places before, but this felt different. I had never experienced anything like this. The ball's movement was unnervingly purposeful, as though something or someone was guiding it. It rolled across the smooth wooden floor with almost eerie precision, gaining speed as it came closer to me. There was no sound, no rattle, no scrape of rubber on wood. It was as if the ball was floating toward me. I took another step back, my breath shallow, my senses on high alert. The gym felt colder now, the air thicker, as though the temperature had dropped in an instant. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was a strange heaviness in the room, a weight that I couldn't explain. The ball came closer and closer, its movements still unnaturally smooth. My hand instinctively reached for the flashlight, gripping it tightly as I prepared to leave. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the basketball. It stopped just a few feet from me. The silence was deafening. I could feel the tension in the air, a presence in the room that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. There had to be a logical explanation, right? A hidden mechanism, perhaps, but no, everything was still. The ball wasn't moving because of wind or some hidden force. It was simply there, waiting. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a cautious step back. My foot hit something hard and empty, discarded bottle, and it clattered to the floor, breaking the stillness with a loud echo. The ball, seemingly unfazed, remained in place. But then, as I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound, barely audible, like a whisper on the edge of my hearing. It was coming from the direction of the ball. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if the sound was beckoning me, urging me to come closer. My pulse quickened, and I fought the urge to run. I turned back toward the ball, its presence now far more unsettling than before. The ball was still there, motionless, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It felt wrong, like something was about to happen. I stepped forward again, my body tense, each movement calculated. The faint whispering sound seemed to grow louder as I approached the ball. It wasn't coming from the ball itself, but from the space around it. The sound was cold, distant, like the faintest echoes of a past conversation, one that had been long forgotten. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt an odd pull toward the ball. It was as if the room was closing in around me, drawing me toward it. Just as I reached the ball, the lights in the gym flickered. The entire room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the building itself had come to life. I reached down to pick up the ball, my fingers brushing its surface. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, and a jolt of electricity shot through my body as I made contact. I yanked my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights flickered again, this time going out completely, plunging me into total darkness. For a moment I stood frozen in the pitch-black gym, my senses overwhelmed. The faint whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of my own breathing, ragged and panicked. The silence returned, heavier than before. I reached for the flashlight in my pocket, but before I could pull it out, the sound of footsteps echoed through the gym, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the ball. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my footsteps thundering in the silence, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just behind me, getting closer with each step. I didn't look back, not even once, until I finally burst through the doors of the rec center and into the daylight. I never went back to that place again. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of the basketball rolling across the gym floor and the whisper that called me closer. Story 13. I had been hiking in the forest for hours when I stumbled upon the entrance to the bunker. The path had narrowed as I wandered deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and the air cooler. I wasn't expecting to find anything out of the ordinary, just a quiet hike through the old woods, but then I saw an odd, metal hatch partially obscured by moss and vines. It was so hidden that I almost missed it, but something about it caught my eye, like it was calling to me. Curiosity got the best of me. I knelt down and pushed aside the overgrowth, revealing the rusty handle of the hatch. It was surprisingly sturdy despite its age. After a few moments of tugging, the door finally creaked open, revealing a dark staircase that descended into the earth. The air was cool and stale, and a musty smell hit me as I peered down into the blackness below. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was wise to explore, but the pull of mystery was too strong, and I began my descent. The staircase was narrow and steep, but well maintained for something so old. At the bottom, I found myself in a large underground room, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. The space was surprisingly clean and organized. The shelves lined the walls, stocked with neatly sealed containers and bags of food. There were stacks of water bottles and crates of canned goods, all clearly labeled with expiration dates that were several years old, but still seemingly untouched. The room looked like it had been carefully maintained, yet there was no sign of recent activity. What struck me immediately was how everything seemed so preserved. The food had a layer of dust on it, as if the place had been left untouched for a long time, yet the lights above were working, and the room appeared otherwise intact. As I moved deeper into the bunker, I noticed something else that seemed out of place: a calendar pinned to the wall. It was yellowed with age, the pages brittle to the touch. But one thing stood out among all the dust and decay. Today's date was circled in bright red ink. I stared at it for a long moment, confusion settling over me. How could something be so old, yet so timely? I walked closer to the calendar, my feet moving quietly across the concrete floor. The circle around today's date seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. There was no reason for it to stand out so much in a place that seemed so abandoned. I felt a chill run down my spine as I examined it, trying to make sense of the contradiction. The rest of the calendar was covered in the same dust and grime, as though it hadn't been touched in years, but today was circled in red. It didn't add up. I turned my attention back to the shelves, searching for some explanation. The food, the supplies, the lights, they all seemed to suggest that someone had been here recently. But why would they have left so much behind? Why were the shelves stocked with food as if the bunker were in active use, yet everything else screamed abandonment? It was as though the place had been prepared for someone, and yet no one had ever returned to claim it. I explored further, pulling open drawers and cabinets, but found nothing that offered any answers. The place was eerily quiet, except for the occasional flicker of the lights overhead. I moved towards the back of the room, where a small desk sat against the wall. A single chair was tucked beneath it, and a notebook lay open on the desk. I flipped it open, scanning the pages. It was filled with notes, some technical, others more personal, detailing various survival strategies, equipment inventories, and emergency procedures. But what caught my eye was the final entry, written in frantic handwriting. Day 36. The lights are still working. I'm beginning to run out of food, but I have enough water. I can't leave. They told me not to leave. If anyone finds this, don't trust the calendar. Don't trust the date. The words were jumbled, almost impossible to read in parts, but the message was clear. Someone had been here, trapped or hiding, and they had left behind a warning. I closed the notebook, my mind racing. Was this a message from someone who had been trapped here, or had it been left by the person who built the bunker in the first place? Why would they warn me about the calendar? My hand trembled as I reached for the calendar again, but this time I noticed something else. Beneath the red circle, there was something written in small, nearly invisible letters. I leaned in closer, squinting in the dim light. Look, the words seemed to blend into the yellowed paper, but I could just make them out. Don't open the second door. A second door. I had only seen the hatch at the entrance, but the idea of another door hidden somewhere in the bunker sent a shiver through me. Where could it be? My gaze scanned the room, trying to find any clue that might point me in the right direction. And then my eyes fell on a section of the wall near the back that looked slightly different from the rest. There, almost perfectly hidden among the shelves, was a small door, its handle almost invisible against the concrete wall. It blended in so well with the surroundings that I hadn't noticed it before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I approached it, my mind racing with the implications of what I might find beyond it. Should I open it? The warning on the calendar echoed in my mind, don't open the second door. But I couldn't resist. Something inside me urged me to find out what was hidden behind it. I reached for the handle and turned it slowly, the door creaking open with a sound that seemed far too loud in the silence of the bunker. The room beyond was small and cramped, its walls lined with more shelves, but unlike the rest of the bunker, this room was completely empty. There was nothing in here, no food, no supplies, nothing at all. Just bare concrete walls, cold and uninviting. But what struck me most was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I backed out of the room quickly, my pulse racing. I slammed the door shut, the echo ringing in my ears. The bunker suddenly felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in around me. I looked back at the calendar, at the red circle on today's date, and felt a deep, unsettling dread take hold of me. I needed to leave. Whatever this place was, whatever its purpose had been, I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. The calendar, the warnings, the second door, everything about the bunker felt wrong. I hurried back to the hatch, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed back up the stairs and pushed the door open, I could have sworn I heard something, faint footsteps, or maybe just the wind coming from somewhere deep within the bunker. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. Story 14. The thrift store was a forgotten relic tucked away in a quiet corner of town. Its windows were clouded with grime, and the peeling paint on the door gave it the appearance of a place that had been abandoned long ago. I had stumbled upon it by accident, the sign out front barely visible through the overgrown vines and rusted chain. Curiosity had gotten the best of me, and I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges loud in the otherwise silent street. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the shelves were cluttered with items that seemed to have been there for decades. Old furniture, books with yellowed pages, and mismatched dishes filled the store, creating a chaotic jumble of forgotten things. The floor was uneven, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, making it clear that no one had stepped foot in this place for a very long time. Yet something about the store intrigued me, as if it held a secret I needed to uncover. I wandered deeper into the store, the dim light barely illuminating the narrow aisles. There was something eerie about the stillness, as though the place was frozen in time. Every now and then, my foot would bump into a discarded item, sending a soft thud echoing through the space. As I walked past a row of shelves, I noticed something strange: a camcorder sitting on a dusty counter, its small screen flickering to life. The camcorder seemed out of place in the midst of the old, worn-out items. Its lens was pointed at a corner of the store, capturing an empty space. I stepped closer, intrigued by the sudden movement on the screen. At first it seemed like nothing, just the dim interior of the store and the faint outline of the shelves in the background. But as I watched more closely, my breath caught in my throat. The footage on the camcorder was playing on a loop, showing someone walking through the store. At first, it looked like an ordinary scene: someone browsing through the old clothes, touching the fabrics, inspecting the items on the shelves. But as I watched, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The person in the video was wearing the exact same clothes I was wearing at that very moment. I looked down at myself, my hands trembling as I examined the faded blue jeans, the worn-out sneakers, and the oversized hoodie I had thrown on before leaving my apartment. The person in the footage wore the same outfit. Everything was identical, from the color of the fabric to the way the sleeves hung slightly over the wrists. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath becoming shallow as I tried to process what I was seeing. I backed away from the camcorder, my mind spinning. It couldn't be me, could it? How was it possible that someone in the video was wearing the same clothes, walking in the same manner, moving through the exact same aisles I was standing in? I glanced around the store, half expecting to see someone else, someone who had been filming me, but the store was as empty as it had been when I first entered. There was no one else around. The footage continued to loop, the person in the video moving along the aisles just as I had, their footsteps mirroring mine. My throat tightened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The strange sense of déjà vu washed over me, the feeling that I had somehow seen this moment before. But how? I hadn't been in this store before, hadn't even known it existed until today. I leaned closer to the camcorder, my eyes fixed on the screen. The person in the video was now approaching the same corner where I had been standing moments ago. They reached for an old book on the shelf, their fingers brushing against the worn cover. I looked around the store, but there was nothing unusual in the area. The same dust, the same forgotten items, all in their place. As the footage continued to play, I began to feel as if the person in the video was somehow watching me, following my every move. I glanced nervously over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the store remained empty. The longer I stared at the screen, the more unsettling the situation became. The person in the video was me, or at least, they looked exactly like me. How could this be? A sudden thought crossed my mind. What if the camcorder had been recording me without my knowledge? What if someone else had filmed me in this store, somehow capturing the moment when I stepped in? I tried to shake off the unease, but the thought clung to me, refusing to let go. I couldn't explain how or why the footage was showing me, but the idea of being filmed without my consent made my skin crawl. I reached for the camcorder, my fingers brushing the dusty surface as I prepared to turn it off. But before I could, the footage flickered and the image on the screen shifted. The person in the video, the one who looked like me, was no longer walking through the store. They were standing still, facing directly at the camera. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the lens, and I couldn't help but feel that they were staring directly at me. I froze, unable to look away. The figure in the video didn't move, didn't blink, but I could feel their gaze burning into me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought the figure in the video might reach out, might step through the screen and into the store with me. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, suffocating me with the weight of the staring eyes on the screen. I snapped back to reality, my heart racing in my chest. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door. My footsteps echoed through the empty store as I ran, my mind still reeling from what I had just seen. I didn't look back as I pushed open the door and stepped out into the daylight. The sun felt almost too bright after the dim, oppressive atmosphere of the store. Story 15. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a forgotten road, its weathered boards sagging under the weight of years. The surrounding fields were overgrown with tall grass, and the air smelled thick with the musty scent of old wood and decay. I had been looking for something to explore, something abandoned, and the farmhouse seemed like it held a promise of secrets buried beneath its crumbling exterior. I pushed open the creaky gate and made my way toward the front door, which hung ajar as if inviting me in. Inside, the air was stagnant, untouched by time, save for the dust that covered every surface. The floorboards groaned underfoot, their creases filled with years of grime. The faint smell of mildew lingered, mixing with the earthy scent of rotting wood. The house was strangely still, as though its inhabitants had vanished in an instant, leaving everything as it was. There was no sign of life, no traces of anyone having been there recently. I explored room by room, fascinated by the decay, until I came across a door at the back of the house that stood out. The door was at the end of a narrow hallway, its wood chipped and worn, but it was the padlock on it that caught my attention. It looked new compared to the rest of the house, the metal shiny and undisturbed. Around the handle, deep claw marks were etched into the wood, as if something or someone had tried desperately to break through. I couldn't help but wonder what lay behind that door, what kind of thing had left such marks. A sense of unease settled in my chest, but curiosity outweighed my fear. I tried the padlock, but it didn't budge. I could hear the sound of my breath echoing in the stillness of the house. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but the claw marks made me think twice. Something about the room felt wrong, like it was meant to be kept hidden. But that only fueled my desire to see inside. I found a rusted crowbar in a nearby closet, and after several minutes of struggle, the lock finally gave way with a loud snap. The door creaked open, revealing a room cloaked in shadows. The room was small, barely big enough to move around in. It was dimly lit by a single grimy window that let in just a sliver of daylight. The walls were covered in scratch marks, long, deep gouges that ran the length of the room. The floor was bare except for a mattress shoved against one corner, its fabric torn and stained. The mattress seemed to have been used, but not in the way one would expect. The The surrounding area was littered with odd, half-finished drawings scratched into the walls with something sharp, perhaps a nail or a piece of metal. But what truly caught my eye was the bowl sitting in the center of the room. It was made of a chipped ceramic, dirty and worn, with a simple label on it, "Do not feed." The words were scrawled in a hurried, jagged hand, as though whoever had written them was desperate to convey a warning. I moved closer to the bowl, my mind racing with questions. What was it for? Who had left it here? I couldn't understand what kind of creature or person would need to be kept locked away in a room like this. A chill ran down my spine as I imagined the possibilities. Had someone been kept here, trapped and isolated? The scratch marks on the walls seemed to suggest something more animal than human, a kind of madness or desperation that left a permanent imprint on the room. The mattress appeared like it had been slept on by someone, perhaps someone who had been locked away in this very room for a long time, kept hidden from the world outside. The drawings on the wall told a story, but one that was incomplete, as if the artist had been too afraid or too driven by some unknown force to finish their work. I glanced at the bowl again. Its label sent a wave of dread through me, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to touch it. What if something had been in it? What if the bowl had been used for something darker than food? The thought lingered in my mind, an unsettling image that I couldn't shake. Still, I couldn't resist the pull of the room. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, feeling the floorboards creak under my weight. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant creak of the house settling. I moved cautiously around the room, taking in every detail. The walls were covered in more of the same marks, claw-like scratches that seemed to get deeper and more frantic as they reached the far end. It was as if whatever or whoever had been in this room had been trying to escape, trying to claw their way through the walls in a desperate bid for freedom. My fingers brushed the edge of the mattress, and I flinched as something soft and damp met my touch. I quickly pulled my hand away, wiping it on my jeans. The sense of being watched, of something just out of sight, grew stronger. It was as if the room was alive, breathing, pulsing with some unseen energy. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I wasn't alone in this room. I could feel it. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard something soft, almost inaudible, coming from the shadows. It was a low sound, like a soft scraping, like something moving just beyond my line of sight. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The air seemed to thicken around me, suffocating me with the weight of whatever presence lingered here. I felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands trembled as I pulled the padlock back into place, the heavy metal clanking in the silence. I didn't look back as I hurried down the hallway and out of the farmhouse. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields as I made my way to the gate. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, but the farmhouse was empty, silent. I never returned to that house. The image of the bowl with its chilling warning stayed with me long after I left. Whatever had been kept behind that locked door, whatever had left those marks on the walls, was better left undisturbed. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden. And that farmhouse, with its padlocked rooms and its disturbing remnants, was one secret I was glad to leave behind. Story 16. Dust swirled a narrow beam of my flashlight as I stepped onto the creaking wooden floor. The attic smelled of mildew and something stale, a scent that made my stomach twist. My breath caught when I noticed a rumpled sleeping bag pushed against the far wall, next to a stack of empty cans. Half-eaten food sat on an overturned crate, fresh enough to suggest someone had been here recently. I crouched, examining the discarded wrappers and a dented thermos lying on its side. The silence in the attic felt heavier now, as if the house itself was waiting for something. I turned quickly, scanning the dark corners where the weak light barely reached. The walls sloped inward, dust-covered beams overhead framing the eerie space. A faint scuffling noise sent a shiver down my spine, making me question whether I was truly alone. The air felt thick with an unspoken presence, the kind that makes your skin prickle. I stepped toward the sleeping bag, hesitating before nudging it with my boot. It was cold to the touch, but that didn't mean whoever had been here wouldn't return soon. A small notebook lay beside it, its cover warped from moisture. I picked it up carefully, flipping through pages filled with erratic, cramped handwriting. The words were difficult to read, but phrases like "can't leave" and "it watches" stood out in the dim light. A sudden creak from below made my pulse jump. I turned off my flashlight instinctively, holding my breath as I listened. The house had been abandoned for years, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs told me otherwise. Slowly, I backed toward the attic door, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps paused, and a faint whisper drifted up from below. It wasn't words exactly, more like the rustling of breath against the still air. I pressed myself against the attic wall, trying to quiet my breathing. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this a squatter, or had I stumbled into something far worse? The silence stretched unbearably before the footsteps resumed, this time retreating. I exhaled slowly, gripping the notebook tightly as I edged toward the attic door. The stairs below remained eerily quiet, but I knew better than to assume I was safe. Whatever had been down there could still be waiting. For a moment, I considered leaving the attic as quickly as possible, but curiosity held me in place. I turned the pages of the notebook again, scanning the last few entries. The handwriting grew frantic, sentences trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. A chill ran through me as I read the final words. "It knows I see it. It's coming up the stairs now." My throat tightened, and I forced myself to look toward the attic entrance. The door was open, just as I had left it, but darkness loomed beyond it like a hungry void. Something moved in the shadows below, a slow, deliberate shift of weight. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I felt the overwhelming certainty that I was being watched. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. The air grew colder, as if the temperature had dropped in an instant. My breath misted in the dim attic light, the stillness pressing in around me. The sound of something brushing against the wooden steps made me shudder. I took a slow step backward, the floor groaning beneath my weight. The noise from below stopped abruptly, as if whatever was there had heard me. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out all other sound. A whisper of movement sent a fresh jolt of fear through me, this time much closer. The attic door creaked ever so slightly, shifting inward, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. I turned and moved as quickly as I dared, careful not to make more noise. The attic had a small window, its glass cracked but intact. My only escape would be squeezing through it and hoping the drop wasn't too far. The floor creaked behind me, and I didn't hesitate. I braced myself against the wooden frame, forcing the window open as quietly as possible. The night air was sharp against my face, a stark contrast to the attic's oppressive atmosphere. I slid through the gap, the edge of the glass scraping my jacket as I maneuvered onto the slanted roof. My feet struggled for purchase, the damp shingles slicked beneath my weight. A sudden rustling from inside the attic made my stomach lurch. I didn't look back. Instead, I focused on the edge of the roof, where an old trellis leaned against the side of the house. It was rickety and splintered, but it was my best chance. As I climbed down, the attic window behind me slammed shut with a force that echoed in the empty night. My pulse roared in my ears, my breath coming in short gasps as I reached the ground. I stumbled back, staring up at the darkened window. Nothing moved behind the glass, but I knew something had been there. I turned and ran, the old house looming behind me as if watching my retreat. The notebook was still clutched in my shaking hands. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I slid into the driver's seat. My hands trembled as I started the engine, my headlights casting long shadows against the abandoned house. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the attic window, but when I blinked, it was gone. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts tangled with the words from the notebook. The writer had been trapped there, convinced something was watching them. Had they escaped, or had I just stepped into their place? I left the notebook on my desk, too unnerved to open it again that night. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams of shadowed figures and creaking attic steps. By morning, I knew I had to go back. The house was still and silent when I returned, but something felt different. The attic window, the one I had squeezed through, was now shut and unbroken, as if I had never been there at all. Story 17. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stepped into the dimly lit storage facility. Rows of metal doors lined the long corridor, their padlocks glinting under the flickering overhead lights. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the soft hum of electricity buzzing through the wires above. I had chosen this location for a nighttime photo shoot, drawn to the eerie atmosphere and the way shadows stretched unnaturally in the artificial glow. The air smelled of dust and metal, carrying a faint hint of something musty. As I adjusted my camera settings, my eyes landed on a single unit at the far end of the corridor with its light on. Curiosity prickled at my senses, and I moved toward the open unit. The stark white glow inside made it stand out against the surrounding darkness, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. When I stepped into the doorway, I found nothing inside except a single wooden chair facing the wall. A chill ran down my spine as I studied the unsettling scene before me. The chair was old, its paint chipped and peeling as if it had been abandoned for years. There were no other objects, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate why the light had been left on. I hesitated, debating whether to step inside or leave it alone. Something about the way the chair faced the wall felt intentional, almost ritualistic. I lifted my camera and snapped up a photo, the shutter echoing through the empty facility. The moment the flash went off, the overhead lights flickered violently. I took a step back, my breath quickening as a strange static crackled through the air. My instincts screamed at me to turn and leave, but something rooted me to the spot. I peered closer at the wall in front of the chair, noticing faint scratches on the surface. Running my fingers over them, I realized they formed letters, though they were too faded to read clearly. A sudden gust of cold air brushed against my neck, making me whip around. The hallway was empty, yet the heavy silence felt different, as if something unseen was watching me. My camera hung limply from its strap as I considered my next move. Every part of me wanted to run, but an inexplicable pull kept me anchored to the spot. I crouched down, brushing away the dust on the floor near the chair. More scratches marred the concrete, deeper than the ones on the wall. They looked like tally marks, long rows of them etched with deliberate force. A soft creak cut through the stillness, making my pulse spike. I snapped my gaze toward the chair, my stomach lurching as I realized it had shifted slightly. The legs had scraped against the floor, moving it just enough to be noticeable. I took a shaky breath and lifted my camera again, snapping another photo. As soon as the flash illuminated the room, a loud bang echoed from somewhere down the corridor. The sound sent a jolt of panic through me, and I spun around to face the darkened hallway. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I strained to hear anything beyond the ringing silence. I gripped my camera tighter, stepping backward toward the exit. Every shadow in the facility felt alive, shifting unnaturally as the overhead lights flickered again. The chair scraped against the floor behind me, sending ice down my spine. I turned just in time to see it move another inch, as if someone unseen had pushed it. My breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I forced myself to take a step toward the exit, my legs stiff with fear. The second I moved, the door to the storage unit slammed shut with a deafening thud. Darkness swallowed me whole, and I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I struggled to turn on the flashlight. The small beam of light barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The chair was now directly in the center of the unit, no longer facing the wall. My chest tightened as I realized there was no way it could have moved on its own. I took another step back, pressing myself against the cold metal door. My fingers searched for the handle, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air in the unit felt heavy, pressing down on me like an unseen force. A whisper broke the silence, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. It came from the direction of the chair, a breathy, unintelligible sound that sent a violent shiver through me. I yanked at the door handle, my panic rising when it wouldn't budge. My phone's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing behind the chair. It was only a brief glimpse before the light cut out completely, plunging me into darkness. A breath that was not my own stirred the air near my ear. Pure terror took over, and I slammed my shoulder against the door with all my strength. The metal groaned before finally giving way, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. My legs nearly gave out as I scrambled to put distance between myself and the unit. The light inside flickered one last time before going out completely, leaving the chair shrouded in darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Clutching my camera, I bolted toward the exit, my pulse hammering in my skull. The night air was a shock to my burning lungs as I burst outside. My car sat where I left it, but even as I ran toward it, I felt something lingering behind me. The sensation of being watched didn't fade until I was inside with the doors locked. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel as I struggled to calm my breathing. The storage facility loomed in the rearview mirror, its dark corridors stretching into nothingness. A deep unease settled in my chest, warning me that whatever I had encountered was not meant to be disturbed. With shaking fingers, I reviewed the photos on my camera. Most of them were as expected, dimly lit shots of the empty hallway and the chair. But then I reached the last one, the one I had taken before the lights had gone out. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the image. The chair was still there, but this time a figure sat in it. Their face was turned toward the camera, their features blurred, yet unmistakably human. I dropped the camera, my skin crawling with horror. I had been alone in that unit, or at least I had thought I was. Without another glance at the storage facility, I started my car and drove away, vowing never to return. Story 18. The city stretched out beneath me, a sea of glowing lights against the dark sky. Wind howled through the skeletal beams of the unfinished skyscraper, rattling loose sheets of metal. I stood at the edge of the structure, gazing down at the tiny cars moving like insects far below. The thrill of being somewhere forbidden sent a shiver of excitement through me. I had climbed through a loose section of the fence, my heart pounding with the risk of getting caught. The site was supposed to be off limits, but I couldn't resist the allure of seeing the city from so high up. My footsteps echoed eerily in the vast, empty space as I made my way to the top floor. The unfinished floors were nothing but steel and concrete, exposed to the elements. The air smelled of dust and metal, a mix of construction materials and neglect. I carefully stepped around tools left behind by workers, their presence lingering in the scattered debris. In the dim light, shadows twisted into strange shapes against the unfinished walls. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ignore the creeping unease settling in my chest. The sudden gust of wind sent a loose plastic sheet flapping violently against the beams. I flinched at the sound, my nerves already on edge. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, making the building groan and shift. But as I turned back to the view, I heard it breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from directly behind me. My body went rigid, every hair on my neck standing on end. The sound was unmistakable, the quiet inhale and exhale of someone close enough to touch me. I turned around in one swift motion, my breath caught in my throat. But there was nothing there, only empty space and the dim glow of the city below. My pulse pounded as I scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. The steel beams cast long dark shadows, making it hard to tell where the light ended and darkness began. The breathing had been so close, so real, yet there was no one in sight. A sharp chill crept down my spine as I took a cautious step back. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths, trying to shake off the fear gripping my chest. Maybe I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me in the eerie silence of the unfinished building. But as I took another step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, like unseen eyes boring into my back. The wind picked up again, making the steel framework groan and creak around me. I turned my gaze to the dark corners of the structure, half expecting to see a shadow move. The silence stretched on, thick with an unseen presence. My gut twisted with the overwhelming urge to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. I took a deep breath and started moving toward the exit, my footsteps careful on the uneven surface. The unfinished beams cast long, skeletal shapes across the floor, warping under the dim security lights. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened around me. The city outside seemed impossibly far away, like another world entirely. Just as I reached the stairs, I heard it again, the breathing, louder this time, right at my ear. Cold terror slammed into me as I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The space behind me was empty, nothing but the dark framework of the skyscraper. But I knew, without a doubt, that I was not alone. My hands clenched into fists as I forced myself to move faster, my legs shaking beneath me. The staircase loomed ahead, an open metal structure leading down into darkness. I hesitated only for a second before gripping the railing and descending as quickly as I could. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body tense with the feeling of something unseen just behind me. The wind howled through the empty floors, carrying whispers that made my skin crawl. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had heard, but no logical explanation came. The construction site was abandoned for the night, there shouldn't have been anyone here. And yet, the sensation of being followed never faded. I reached the lower floors, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to not look back, but I couldn't help myself. I turned one last time, my breath catching in my throat. In the dim glow of a distant streetlight, a shadow stood motionless at the top of the stairs. The figure was barely visible, blending into the darkness like it belonged there. My body locked up, fear rooting me to the spot. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could still hear it breathing, steady and deliberate, as if waiting. My mouth went dry, and I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward toward the exit. I burst out onto the ground level, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. My lungs burned as I sucked in breath after breath, my hands shaking. I spun around to look back at the building, my heart still hammering in my chest. The top floors loomed above, empty and silent, but I knew better now. I didn't wait to see if the shadow followed. My legs carried me away from the construction site, past the broken fence, and down the deserted street. The city lights seemed too bright, too normal, a stark contrast to the darkness I had just escaped. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to not slow down until I was far, far away. When I finally dared to glance back, the skyscraper stood still and silent against the night sky. No sign of movement, no figure watching from the unfinished floors. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. And deep down, I knew I had not been alone up there. Story 19. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, especially hotels. There was something eerie about them, the idea that once they were filled with life and now they stood empty, decaying into nothingness. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when I decided to explore the old, sealed-off hotel downtown. The building had been abandoned for years, but I had heard rumors of hidden rooms in forgotten areas, places people weren't supposed to find. The front doors were boarded up, but a small side window had been cracked open just enough to slip through. Inside, the hotel was a ghost of its former self. Or dust and decay had taken over, but there was something unsettlingly beautiful about the way the sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I wandered through the dim halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Each room I peeked into revealed more of the same old furniture covered in sheets, cracked mirrors, and peeling wallpaper. But there was a particular door that caught my attention. It was hidden behind a set of thick curtains, almost as though someone didn't want it to be found. I pushed the curtains aside and found myself standing in front of a sealed-off laundry room. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to lock it properly. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and stale detergent, but what struck me immediately was the sight of dozens of uniforms hanging on shelves. They were all neatly folded, like they had been placed there with care, yet the room itself looked untouched by time. At first I thought nothing of it. Perhaps they were uniforms left behind by staff who had worked here years ago. But as I looked closer, something caught my eye, a name tag on one of the uniforms. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. The name was mine. I had never worked at this hotel, never even been here before, yet there it was. My last name, staring back at me from the small metal tag, perfectly attached to a freshly laundered uniform. I stepped closer, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason why my name would be on a uniform in this abandoned laundry room. But I reached out hesitantly, fingers brushing against the fabric. It was soft, like it had just been washed, but the rest of the room felt cold, frozen in time. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows watching me. But there was nothing. No, just the rows of folded uniforms, all with name tags pinned to the chest. I picked up the uniform with my name tag on it, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu wash over me. It was a hotel staff uniform, simple and clean, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The fabric felt too familiar, like it had been worn by someone who knew me, or perhaps even by me in another life. But how could that be? I had never worked here, never even set foot in this hotel before today. A strange noise broke my thoughts. It was faint at first, like a muffled thump from somewhere deep within the hotel. I froze, holding the uniform tightly, my eyes scanning the room. The noise came again, louder this time, as if something or someone was moving around in the building. I knew I shouldn't be here, but the curiosity was too strong. I couldn't just leave without understanding why my name was on that tag, why the uniform looked so familiar. I had to find out more. I turned and made my way out of the laundry room, the uniform still clutched in my hands. The noise was growing louder now, more distinct. It sounded like footsteps, faint but steady, coming from somewhere nearby. I paused, heart racing. Was someone else in the hotel? I hadn't seen anyone since I had entered. My instincts told me to leave, to turn back and never look at the uniform again, but my feet moved on their own, guiding me deeper into the hotel. I followed the sound of the footsteps, moving cautiously through the dark hallways. The old carpet beneath my feet creaked with every step, the silence only broken by the distant sound of movement. I passed rooms filled with discarded furniture, empty beds, and broken fixtures. The hotel felt more like a maze the deeper I went, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. Finally, I reached a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The footsteps were louder now, echoing in the empty space around me. I had no choice but to go down, my curiosity pulling me forward, despite the growing sense of dread in my chest. The basement was even darker than the rest of the hotel, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. As I descended further, I felt the air grow colder. The floor was damp, and the walls were lined with old pipes and discarded crates. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. But I felt my heart beat in my throat, and for the first time I regretted coming here. But before I could turn back, I saw something at the end of the hallway. A figure standing motionless in the dark. It was hard to make out at first, but as I drew closer I could see that it was a person, or at least it looked like a person. They were wearing a hotel uniform, the same as the one I had found in the laundry room. My heart skipped a beat. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face I didn't recognize, yet it felt strangely familiar. The person said nothing, just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes. I took a step back, holding the uniform tighter. The person didn't move. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How could they be here? And why was I so certain they had something to do with the uniform I had found? The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. Without warning, the figure began to walk toward me, their footsteps echoing in the silence. I backed up, my pulse racing, but my legs felt heavy, like I couldn't move fast enough. The uniform in my hands felt warm now, almost as if it had been worn recently. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. They reached out a hand, and I felt a chill run through my body. I turned and ran, not looking back until I had reached the entrance. When I finally made it outside, I was gasping for air, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the hotel. I looked down at the uniform in my hands, my name tag still clearly visible. The world around me felt surreal, like I had stepped into another reality. I didn't understand what had happened in that hotel, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never return. Story 20. The courthouse had been abandoned for years, its halls now echoing with the sound of my footsteps. The building, once a place of solemn decision-making and legal proceedings, had fallen into a state of ruin. Dust and debris littered the floors, and the once grand architecture now seemed hollow, stripped of its purpose. The walls were cracked, peeling, and in some areas the paint had long since flaked away, revealing layers of forgotten history beneath. I wandered deeper into the heart of the courthouse, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, mold, and something else, something faintly metallic that lingered in the corners of the room. The courthouse had clearly been abandoned for some time, yet there was an unsettling sense that the place was frozen in a moment that hadn't yet passed. My footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, but it was the silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the courthouse had been left in haste, as though the proceedings had been interrupted in a way that no one was willing to explain. I turned a corner and found myself in the courtroom, a vast chamber where the judge's bench still stood in all its faded glory. It was a striking sight, the large wooden structure commanding attention at the front of the room, even in its state of disrepair. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The gavel, once used to bring order to the court, lay on the bench caught mid-swing, as if someone had just been about to strike it when something had caused them to stop abruptly. The gavel rested in mid-air, suspended by a force that seemed impossible. My eyes locked onto the object, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to move. I carefully approached the bench, my footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. The gavel looked perfectly intact, but the way it rested there felt wrong. It was as if it had been placed there in haste, caught in the middle of a gesture that had never been completed. The air in the room felt still, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. I could almost hear the faint echoes of the courtroom proceedings in my mind, the murmurs of the crowd, the rustle of papers, the authority of the judge's voice. But all of that was gone, leaving only this eerie stillness. As I stood there, staring at the gavel, my eyes drifted to the courtroom recorder. It was an old machine, its design outdated by decades, but it still sat there, operational. A red light blinked on the recorder, its steady pulse an anomaly in the otherwise silent room. The machine shouldn't have been on. It was clear that the courthouse had been abandoned for years. Yet there it was, its red light casting an unnatural glow in the otherwise dark room. It was as though someone had just left it running, as if the proceedings had never truly ended. I moved toward the recorder, my curiosity getting the better of me. The machine hummed softly, its tapes spinning with a mechanical precision that seemed almost unnatural. The red light blinked on, unblinking, as if it were waiting for something or someone to return. My heart raced as I stepped closer, wondering who or what had left it on. It felt like a haunting reminder of a time when the courthouse had been full of life, filled with people who had come seeking justice. Now, all that remained was the faintest trace of those echoes, a lingering presence that refused to fade. I knelt beside the recorder, my fingers hovering over the buttons. But should I press play? I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to hear what was on the tape. The room around me felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The recorder blinked at me, its red light casting an eerie glow over the courtroom. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened here was far from over. The gavel seemed to call to me, its unfinished motion frozen in time. It was as if I had stepped into the middle of a moment, trapped between what had happened and what was still yet to come. The recorder's light pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and for a moment, I wondered if I was being watched. My skin crawled with the sensation of unseen eyes on me, but when I turned, the room remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the courthouse was waiting for something, perhaps for the case that had never been finished, or the judgment that had been left unspoken. I stood up, stepping away from the recorder. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in as if the building itself was alive, aware of my presence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. How could this place feel so trapped in time? The recorder, the gavel, the unfinished proceedings, it all pointed to something unresolved. But what? The thought lingered in my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A faint sound, a whisper. It came from the back of the room, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to listen. There was nothing at first, just the sound of the air moving in the room. But then it came again, faint and distant, like the echo of voices long forgotten. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, filled with frustration and confusion. My pulse quickened, and I turned toward the source of the sound, my eyes scanning the shadows. There was no one there. The room remained empty, the only sound the hum of the recorder and the steady ticking of time. I took a step forward, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. It was as if the courtroom itself was waiting for me to do something, to finish what had been started all those years ago. I could feel the weight of the unspoken judgment, the tension in the air that had never been released. With a final glance at the gavel, I turned and walked out of the courtroom. The red light on the recorder blinked steadily behind me, casting an eerie glow on the empty room. As I exited the courthouse, the doors creaking closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. The courthouse, once a place of law and order, had become something else entirely, a place suspended in time, filled with the ghosts of unresolved decisions. And I couldn't help but wonder if I had just become a part of that lingering uncertainty.